Well, we are getting better year by year, let me tell you, at adapting to our liturgical circumstances. It is funny to me to think that as we begin to consider what Holy Week might look like, I can think, oh, well, we've done this before. But Ash Wednesday was a particularly curious set of adjustments. For all of its flexibility, the prayer book, the 1979 Book of Common Prayer, really makes no accommodation for Zoom virtual Ash Wednesday. It really never imagined that there would be an Ash Wednesday in which ashes weren't imposed on your forehead, and all the more an Ash Wednesday in which the service would not end with the celebration of the Eucharist. And so, taking those two things out, especially the ashes, otherwise it's just called Wednesday, we're left wondering a little bit about what it is that exactly that we're here to do. And so, in my sort of quick attempt to try to make something up, I still burned last year's palms. We had plenty because we ordered plenty and they didn't all go. And so I burned last year's palms and sifted them out and actually had really good ashes. I had good ashes for forehead smudges this year. But alas, instead, we ordered these little glass jars, and I poured ashes into each of these. That was Monday morning's sort of kitchen project while the dogs were eating. A little bit of ash in each. How much should I put? Would I have enough? Would I have enough of the little glass jars? All these questions we've never had to ask before. How would I order new ones if I needed them? Would they come in time? What about the snow? And as I looked at these little jars with ashes in them, I realized they reminded me of something. They reminded me of this. You didn't know you were coming for a show and tell sermon. Another little glass jar. Let me tell you about this little glass jar. You can see it's all kind of dirty a little bit. This glass jar is from a monastery, a Greek Orthodox monastery, not a stone's throw from the Jordan River, closer to the river than it is to Jericho. The area, at least 10 years ago, was quite treacherous. All the mines that were planted there by Jordan in the lead up to the 1967 war, well, most of those mines are still there. And so this area that you would go to if you were to go down to the Dead Sea, or if you were to go to cross the bridge to go from Jericho into an Amman, all that is largely still a minefield, still a minefield. This monastery had been there for quite some time, like all monasteries in that part of the world. But it was abandoned in the 67 war because it was too difficult to protect here, surrounded by a minefield. And all the more because when combat began, it went right through the monastery, quite literally. I had a chance to visit it one time when I was serving in my diplomatic role. I was invited to tour that monastery as part of an effort to organize a mine clearing mission. They wanted me to see what was left there. It was haunting to walk around a monastery that had once been so full of life. There were places in the monastery where I imagined myself, why do they put a round window here? Only to remind myself that that wasn't a window. It's where a bomb went through, or a rocket. This thing was littered with rockets. The whole eastern wall of the monastery was but Swiss cheese. Most of the monastery had been cleared out in what was a quick rush to relocate the monks. And so when they left, they didn't take everything. As if I was walking through the remains of something very old, I came upon a room that had cardboard boxes pushed against the wall. They hadn't really looked like they had seen anything since the 1967 war, when they were abruptly abandoned. I went over to the boxes, and the Greek Orthodox monk quickly showed me what was inside. What was inside were hundreds of these glass jars. And I said, what were these for? And he said, these were the jars that we had ready to give to pilgrims so they could go to the water and they could collect the water from the Jordan River. This one in particular is dirty. I don't know if that's because it used to have water from the Jordan River, or maybe it was just debris from the 67 war that found its way in, or just time, maybe time. But these were boxes of jars that never found a home. They were meant to go home with pilgrims who would collect them and fill them with water. I imagine all those pilgrims that used to come through there before the war. Imagine their excitement at being in the Holy Land. That I could relate with, even if I couldn't relate with the experience of a 1950s and early 1960s pilgrimage to the Holy Land. I wondered how different that land would have seemed, even if it wouldn't have looked very different. It wouldn't have looked very different at all, but certainly the politics there would have made the experience different. In fact, you would have been inside Jordan then, not inside the West Bank. And so there were all these different layers in which I was seeing. I imagined all those pilgrims taking that water home. What would they do with their jar of holy water? Maybe they'd give it to their priest to use in baptisms. I've had that before. I've seen jars of water bottles taped shut, filled with gross holy water in sacristies. I've seen that in plenty of sacristies. Ian, that's still somewhere on the sacristy shelf in St. David's from a pilgrimage. I think probably from before 1967. I imagine them taking that holy water home. But they would have known what we are learning tonight, which is that the holy water itself, the little vial itself, similar to this little vial, it is not the point. The water was meant to remind those pilgrims of their own baptism. It was meant to remind those pilgrims of that time when God's self, in the person of Jesus Christ, came to that very water and dipped his toes in it and said, "Baptize me too, John. Baptize me too." And the Spirit of God descended upon Jesus from the clouds and said, "This is my beloved." We remember that every time we baptize a child of our own here. We invite them into that same story that happened in that river, not a stone's throw from this stone-littered monastery. The vial was meant to remind the pilgrims of the love of God and what God could do. It was not in and of itself the purpose of their visit. It was not in and of itself the purpose of their visit. And neither, for all these years, my friends, has ashes been the purpose of our Ash Wednesday. Rather, the little jar of ashes is not any dissimilar from this little jar. Both serve to remind us of what God is doing through us, of what God did through God's Son on a cross. That even though life may end, there is life again. That every day that we share is a gift from God, and that tomorrow is no guarantee. So just as that vial of holy water reminded those pilgrims of their own baptism, my hope is that someday, perhaps now, these little vials, if you come get one, there's a few left. These little vials will remind you that it was never about the ashes on your forehead, but rather the awareness of the shortness of your own life, how very fragile it is. And when we become aware of it, then we realize every day that we have left should be for good, should be for the glory of God. Every breath we can spare between now and the moment in which these ashes prove death true, well, that's meant for love and for light. We enter in again on a different kind of Lenten journey, even if we've sort of run this race before. My hope is that in these 40 days we can collect ourselves and see this long Lenten journey we have been on for nearly a year, and also see all the ways in which God was calling us to appreciate the fragility of life, and let that message sink deep into our hearts so that we might wake up tomorrow and say, thank you. This was no guarantee. Thank you. This was no guarantee. Over and over and over again until it is deep in our bones. And then the little jar of ashes would do exactly what the jar of holy water has done. Command our hearts to hear a voice that descends from the clouds. This is my son. Amen.